The West Texas Shipwrights by James M. Morris. It was Don's idea. He was 10 and I was 7. I guess the recent rains inspired him, having sent a torrent of muddy water down what is normally a dry creek bed behind our house and filled the tank and various ponds in the pasture. He enlisted me as his shipwright apprentice to help him with the construction of a mighty boat that would take us on a great naval adventure down the creek. Time was of the essence, he insisted, since the water would soon be gone, and its sail could not float us upon a prickly pears, native pasture grass, and the sandy loam soil of the creek bottoms. Of course, before construction could commence in earnest, we had to fabricate pirate hats out of different colored construction paper and swords made of wood. Of the hats, I thought not that they resembled anything I had seen a pirate wear in the books I had read. The swords, on the other hand, were handsome indeed, but left splinters in my hand, and were bothersome when stuck through my belt, and hindered my ability to engage in any shipwright building activity. Next, Brother Don and I set a course to scavenge for the supplies needed to construct our seaworthy vessel. Behind the workshop, we found several rusty pieces of corrugated roofing metal. Behind the chicken coop, we found some discarded pieces of 1x4 lumber and a couple of old pieces of 2x4 board of varying lengths. We dragged all the building materials into the open-faced shop for the fabrication of our sailing vessel. Brother Don decided that before we embarked upon the physical task of constructing our schooner, we should first have a plan, a blueprint, he called it. That took us into the house to our bedroom floor with a large piece of paper, which was not blue, a yardstick, and a pencil. He pondered the project in his 10-year-old mind, humming and acting as though great ideas were flowing into his brain. He then drew lines on the paper and intersected some of them, and then he erased some of them, and then he redrew them, and then he made more lines, and finally had drawn something that did not resemble anything I could recognize. And then he stopped, held the paper up, and asked me, "What do you think?" I looked at it, considered everything I had ever seen in my life, and then replied, "What is it?" He said, "It's our boat, dummy. Can't you see it?" I looked harder as I rested my chin on my elbows and said as politely as I could, "Well, which is the front?" Exasperated, Don exclaimed as he pointed, "This is the bow, Dodo. This is the mast," and still pointing, he said, "This is the hull, this is the keel, the bridge, the stern." I asked, "What's a keel?" Don paused, and then he said with great authority, "That's what rams into whales and kills them. Don't you know anything about ships?" Without questioning the accuracy of his definition, I asked, "Do you really think we need a keel on our boat? I don't expect to find any whales in our pasture." Don replied, "Of course we won't find any whales, but every boat needs a keel. Everybody knows that. So I think this plan will work. Let's go build it." Well, that sounded fine to me. My big brother knew a lot more than I did, and I was just happy to get to have this big adventure with him. So we jumped up and headed to the shop. Back at the shop, he marked an imaginary line at one end of the shop and then took 7 or 8 long steps and stopped to visualize the distance. He took 2 more steps and made another imaginary line with his foot and proclaimed, "From here to there is the distance from the bow to the stern of our vessel." Moving forward, he identified where the wheelhouse would be, then the mainmast, then the galley, and then he ran out of boat. He backed up and studied the situation and then declared, "I have decided that our vessel will not have a galley." I should have known better, but instinctively I picked up the longest board we had scavenged and laid it next to the imaginary outline of our ship. The board was tiny in comparison, and then I said, "Aren't we going to need some more board than 10?" Well, apparently the master shipwright had not thought the matter through completely. He looked at our lumber and metal supply, and I could see the wheels turning in his 10-year-old brain. He needed a face-saving response, and suddenly it came to him, and he replied, "Well, we wouldn't expect to build a vessel to sail across the Atlantic Ocean on our first try, would we? That would be foolish, wouldn't it?" I didn't answer that question, and I am glad. I would later learn that it is called a rhetorical question, which is not meant to be answered. Don surveyed our materials and proclaimed, "Apprentice James, that's what you are, and you know, my apprentice, we will build a prototype ship which will lay the foundation for the great vessels we will build when we grow up and form our shipbuilding empire. Do you know what a prototype is, Apprentice James?" I didn't have a clue, but I couldn't tell my big brother that, since it kind of sounded like pronto. "Come here, pronto. Come here, pronto. Come here, pronto." I figured it might be safe to say, "A boat we build real fast?" Don bought it. "That's close enough," he said. "It means our first design, and yes, it must be built really fast. In fact, I think we may need to recruit some extra labor, some more muscle. We need a bosun's mate. Come on, let's go see if we can get Pee-wee to come help us. He likes the water." We raced to the house to recruit something called a bosun's mate, whatever that is. As we were running to the house, I saw Daddy cross the cattle guard headed towards the shop, which doubled as a shed for the car and pickup when he didn't have a project going on. We stormed into the house and found Mama at the sink, and Don yelled, "Can Pee-wee come over and help me and James build a boat?" "James and me," she corrected his grammar. "It's too late today. Does this boat have to be built today?" she asked without turning around. Before Don could answer, the back door slammed, and Daddy entered the room with his own question. "What is that pile of junk doing in the shop?" He looked at me and then directed his stare at Don, who responded, "James and me are building a boat, Dad." And Mom swiftly interjected, "James and I are building a boat." Dad matter-of-factly responded, "I don't care who's building a boat. That pile of junk needs to be moved out of the shop so we can get the car in there in case it rains tonight. You two galley hands take your pirate butt out there and haul your scavenged building material to the other side of the shop and then come in and get cleaned up for supper afore I run you off the starboard plank as shark bait, mate." We obeyed the captain's orders and postponed the building of the ship until the next day. Don successfully recruited Pee-wee, and we picked him up at the grocery store early the next morning and began building. Unfortunately for me, with the addition of Pee-wee to the workforce, I went down in rank and stature and became mostly a gopher. While they hammered the nails, sawed the wood, cut and bent the tin, and tried to fill the cavernous holes with tar, rubber, plaster, and assorted other stuffing. From my perspective, it seemed that corrugated sheet metal was a poor choice of material to cover the exterior of the boat. It proved exceedingly difficult to bend and was prone to crack and had numerous rust holes scattered about its surface. It did not lend itself to fluid designs, and the boat was basically a triangle-shaped object with a flat bottom. The 1x4s proved very flimsy and were poor support for the sheet metal along each side. And the most difficult of all was trying to bend the metal to a point for the front of the boat. Don and Pee-wee spent the entire day hammering and grunting and bending the metal and trying to secure it to the wooden frame of the boat by clenching 8-penny nails and then hammering them repeatedly on Daddy's anvil. They did work at it. Blood flowed more than once. Daddy walked past the work zone occasionally. He stopped, stared, shook his head, walked away. I mostly sat and watched until late that afternoon when the boat, which was maybe 4 feet long and 2 or 2.5 feet wide, was proclaimed complete and ready to launch. At that moment, when the dangerous part was nigh, I was summoned into action by Brother Don. "Apprentice James," he said, "get your sailor hat and sword and be ready to cast off to sea on the maiden voyage of the Miss Pedon We." I did as commanded, and upon my return they had laboriously dragged the heavy vessel from the shop down to the pond just past the pasture gate, where the road turns back east. It rarely holds water, but the recent rain had filled it to its brim, and it measured about 15 feet across by about 25 feet long and was about 4 or 5 feet deep. I arrived and was instructed to get into the boat. However, my weight, plus that of the boat, proved to be more than they could push into the pond. They found a longer piece of corrugated sheet metal to use as a rail on the ground to slide the boat onto the launch into the pond. The boat was pushed partially into the water, and I was instructed then to get into it and sit down at its center. Don and Pee Wee were behind the boat in a pushing posture. Don asked me, "Ready to launch, matey?" I said, "Water is coming in the front of the boat." Pee Wee tossed me a coffee can and said, "This should take care of it." As I started pouring cans of water out of the boat, they gave mighty groans and pushed the boat into the pond as both shouted, "Ahoy!" The momentum carried me several feet into the pond towards its center, but the rate of my forward motion was equaled by the rate of my downward motion. I bailed water as fast as I could, but to no avail. The water was entering the boat from every conceivable crease in the tin, and by the time I reached the center of the pond, the top of the boat was below the surface of the water. I was abandoning ship. I splashed my way back to the shore, wet from head to toe, with my sailor hat disintegrating on my head and my sword tangled in weeds, to the amusement of my older siblings and Pee Wee. We stood on the bank of the pond, unable to see the boat they had labored so hard to build all day. Pee Wee saluted as he said sadly, as the sun sank slowly over the horizon, "C'est la vie, Miss Pedon We." The end.